A wonderful afternoon. And so let's get into it. You know, we've heard so much about COVID, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's really sort of tired about hearing about it. But the reality is we have to do something about it. So before I get started, I wanted to remind everybody that these webinars are good for our professional development point. They're both good for the DDI certification maintenance of the demand-driven planner, the demand-driven leader, and adaptive enterprise foundation. But also because of the relationship between DDI and ASCM, all of the DDI webinars are also available for one professional development point for your APICS or ASCM certifications. So I always like to get that in there first. So I mean, let's talk about this. This is interesting. It's I was in town yesterday, and somebody asked me about my travel schedule. And they said, "Are you continuing to travel?" And I sort of laughed at them, and I said, "How do you think I'm doing that? You know, the flights are canceled. You know, we've seen major meltdown of business around the world, and you know, we're in this massive global kind of change that you know that a lot of people are saying that, well, we've never seen anything like that before. The reality is yeah, we have. As we look at this variety of people that in the variety of crises that we've seen, we've been living in the rise of the VUCA world. You know, from the Hong Kong flu back in the 60s, as we get through SARS, hurricanes, tornadoes, the economic meltdown in the United States in 2008, 9/11, of course, in 2001. Now, these kind of major crises, you know, it's really nothing new. These happen. But the question that we have isn't what's going to happen, is it when is it going to happen, and not if. So the frequency and the severity of our disruptions, as we've seen in the last 20 years, is increasing. So we're living in this very volatile world. And the other question that we have is, you know, it's also very uncertain. We don't know. I mean, if you would have told me in January that in March I would be on the very last flight out of Bogota, Colombia into the United States, and had I not been on that flight, that I would have had the enjoyment of Colombian hospitality for the next 7 weeks before they started to let expats out of the country, I would have never believed that. I had a very full travel schedule. You know, I'm on the road 2 to 3 weeks a month, and all of a sudden I watched, as in 3 days of coming home, I watched 200 events canceled in 4 days. So how do you forecast that? We're living in this very, very uncertain time. And we already know the 3 rules about forecasting. We know forecasts are wrong. We know the further out we try to look, the more wrong they get and the more detail we get. And this is nothing new. But now we're trying to forecast in very unforecastable times. The other thing is we're living in this very complex world. It's interesting. I was around when we named supply chain, and we thought it was so simple. We said, well, supply chain is just from customer to supplier. And it's a chain. It's a link. People are linked together. And were we wrong? Supply chains are not chains. Supply chains are very complex. They're networks. They're linkages together. And what we know, especially as we get into our supply chains today, and it's been exposed finally to people around the world, is that our supply chains have gotten longer. The cumulative lead times have extended as we source and sell globally. And it was very interesting as the grocery stores started to melt down here in the United States. I landed on Saturday, and I stopped at the grocery store on my way home, and I was shocked to see that the meat case was already empty. Nothing. Absolutely nothing in the meat case. The produce department, empty shelves. And I never thought in a million years I would ever see the United States look like that. But then it was interesting because my husband was asking me, he said, well, what do you think is going to happen? And I said, the fresh goods are going to come back first. I said, it's going to take us time before we finally get back to, you know, full shelves. Like last night, I had to stop at the pharmacy, and I saw for the first time a package of disinfectant wipes on the shelf, and I immediately bought it. I didn't even check the price about it. We had not been able to get disinfectant wipes since March here in the United States, in my town. So we've got these long supply chains because we've got a lot of sourcing that's coming in from China. We've got fragmentation. We got a lot more nodes and inputs in the supply chains. Our supply chains are these incredibly connected networks that go around the world. And our supply chains are incredibly fragile, as we saw how quickly our grocery stores here, at least, just emptied because people, of course,
انا عشان
panicked. They
الاسمك
tried to
بتاعي.
make us believe that they tried to make us believe that it was just a switch from going to school or going to work to being home. But come on, there's no way you're going to use up that much toilet paper in about 3 days. And we didn't see toilet paper here in the States for about a month. So it's very fragile. Very small things can make a very, very big difference. You can see the house of cards there. Now, what we also have is they're ambiguous. It's really more and more difficult to tell what's happening. And without getting into the politics here, we cannot believe anything that's on our news media. We don't know, is that really true or is that not true? Is this something that they're going to have to come back later and say, oh, sorry, we got that wrong? And even in our supply chains, we're still being pushed that people are saying we need Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 and blockchain and real-time computing and internet base and all this. And you're saying, I am drowning in data. I have more data being thrown at me than ever, and I'm still starving for relevant information. Somebody please tell me what is going to happen today and tomorrow. So this VUCA world, well, this is our new normal. This is nothing new. It's our new normal. We've been making this shift. And when we compare it to where we're at today, from where we're at in 1965, you notice that it's absolutely the opposite. When you think about what we had to manage, we didn't need to worry about cyber attacks. We didn't have to worry about elongated supply chains. We didn't have to worry about imports from China. All right, we had rather long product life cycles, and our customer tolerance time was actually really quite long. Now, why did we pick 1965? Well, that's because that's when most of our planning rules and tools were developed. And now we're living in a world that didn't even exist at the time that our methodologies that we use daily were developed. So as we look at this, Harvard Business put this out a few years ago, and it's still relevant today because we've been watching this develop over the last 4 or 5 years, and we've seen the case. And they investigated 30,000 publicly held companies here in the United States. And what happened is they estimated that 1 out of 3 are going to delist in the next 5 years. That's crazy. Okay, you think about it, 1 out of 3. This is the backbone of the American economy. And just to put it in perspective, that is 6 times the delisting rate of even just 10 years ago. Okay, 6 times. And what's interesting is it's not respect to a certain industry sector, not to respect to a certain size or age of company. It all comes down to one simple thing. Companies are dying because the rate of change outside the company is faster than the rate of change inside the company. And that's what it's all about. I mean, you basically have 2 choices today as a company. You either learn how to adapt or you die. And it's really that simple. So, well, that's sort of all the bad news. So how do we get out of this? How do we look ahead and how do we move forward? We can't stay where we're at because we know the world around us is going to continue to change and we're going to go by the way of the dodo bird if we do. So first, it's all about leadership. Leadership must start with the big assumption that disruptions are going to happen. I just saw the email come through today about Clem Sumter doing a webinar for you guys later. And I had the real honor and privilege of traveling with him as we did several regional conferences. And I loved his book, The Eye of the Fox, because he and his co-author noted certain flags, not trends. You're not going to get enough data for a trend. All you're going to get is a flag. Something's going to happen. And then it's our ability to be able to react quickly. And of course, Clement, this quite well known, that him and his co-author actually identified the fact that George Bush would have a very large terrorist attack on American soil to deal with during his presidency. Now, they thought it was going to be nuclear, and it turned out it was 9/11, but still, they knew something was going to happen. They knew about when it was going to happen because there were sufficient flags. We are not going to see trends. We have to be able to pick up these flags and react to it. So we have to assume these big disruptions are going to happen. We just don't know when, and we don't know exactly where. And the second thing is, as leadership, we cannot build our businesses and our supply chain models based on profit maximization strategies that ignore point number one. So see point number one, things are going to happen. COVID, it absolutely drives me crazy. You're going to hear Carol's little pet peeve right now, is everybody's got to quarantine so that when we come out, we're safe. We're not going to be safe. The virus is out there. The whole reason for the quarantine was to just slow down the number of people with the virus so that they could manage the load against the capacity of the hospital. Doesn't mean that it's not a forest fire. It doesn't go over you and then you come out and everything's cool. Doesn't work that way. Wish it did, but it doesn't. So we still have to deal with this crisis, and we cannot build business as usual and say, oh, if we can just minimize cost, we're going to maximize profit. So we need to be the most efficient, have the highest utilization, and the best overhead absorption, and be totally focused on getting that unit cost down. So what's going to happen? This came out of that same Harvard Business Review article in 2016. So what about collapse? Now, this is interesting because as we're living through this COVID crisis, you're watching new business models being developed. Our local grocery store now, they used to charge to do your grocery shopping for you. Well, now they don't anymore. Well, you know what? I like it because I always hated grocery shopping anyway. So I'm taking the advantage of, I'll let them do it. I get online, a few clicks, all done. Well, what's that going to mean to the whole grocery store industry? What are these changes happening? Second, what about a shock in one part of the business spreads to another part? As we look at fire in a plant in China can shut down an automotive assembler in the United States. Fat Tal, this is where we're at right now. We are living in a natural disaster, okay, global natural disaster. It's affecting every country around the world. And, we got to deal with it. Now, what's another one that we could have? We could also have a discontinuity risk. And I think we're going to see some of this as we start to adapt to this COVID world that we're living in. I love talking to executives. They said, well, when we get into the post-COVID era, and it's like, you're there, deal with it. All right. There's not going to be a switch where things are going to go back to the way they were in January 2020. How are we going to deal with this discontinuity, this new world that we're living in? The other one is obsolescence, that we're failing to adapt to customer needs. What are the innovations out there? And finally, rejection. We've seen some of this with the airline industry. If you watch the videos of United Airlines as they drag that passenger off the plane, that quarter on United's profitability and their share price dropped by 70%. 70%. So it's a rejection risk. So it's participants that are in our ecosystem. We pick up the news here that child labor was being used in China to make Nike sneakers, and everybody's protesting Nike. So these 6 risks aren't just with respect to COVID. It's respect to what we need to do with our supply chains. Where do we go from here? We have to deal with these. This is not about efficiency, utilization, and overhead absorption. It is about how do we deal with these 6 risks. So we have a need for resilience. Well, what is resilience? First, let's make sure we get the definition down. We need to get back or restore some kind of system equilibrium through a large shock or after a large shock. Okay, so COVID will become system normal. How do we get back to some kind of equilibrium? How do we get this resilient supply chain? How do we get a robustness so that we know that our supply chains can withstand these shocks? And then how is it that we can recover? Is there something we can focus on? Is there a blueprint? Has somebody thought this through? Is somebody being successful with this? But first, let me give you a warning. And I think this is probably the biggest thing we can focus on. Management cannot focus on cost minimization to build a post-COVID-19 supply chain strategy. It is not about efficiency. It is not about multi-echelon inventory optimization where we say we have to balance customer service with our amount of inventory. It is not about reducing unit cost. It's a trap. All right, if we continue down that road, those companies will die. We're seeing the impact today around the world. Cost jeopardizes resilience. And you see some pictures there. Our cost strategies that focus on cost minimization rely on a very predictable and consistent volume so that we can achieve that steady state minimization of cost with the maximization of profit. All right, so that's one thing. The second thing, when I don't get the volume, because of course what we've included is a number of non-relevant costs, because we've included all of our overhead rates and all of our labor rates and all of those kind of things, which are spread over the expected volume that we have. So when I don't see the volume, there's three bottom line effects, and we see it worldwide. I have too much of the wrong stuff. I got too little of the right stuff. Overall, I got too much stuff, and I am driving my supply chain people crazy trying to attempt course corrections to be able to react to what the market is really requiring. It is absolute. We've seen it around the world. And what we also see, that assets are fundamentally misaligned to the market. Here's where we've got all of our investments in our company assets, and they are fundamentally misaligned to the market. And the larger the disruption, the worse the misalignment. And we are seeing this today. Absolutely one of my favorite stories. As I said, I do my grocery shopping online now. Well, it gives you at the bottom, it says, here's all the things that are on special. Well, one of the things that's on special is those little boneless pork roasts that we can get here in the United States. On special, less than half price. But they've just closed down all of our pork packing plants here in the United States. So there's no supply, but they still put it on promotion. So we get the larger the disruption, the worse the misalignment. It's just crazy. And the bigger the misalignment, the lower the chance a company has of surviving this kind of major hit to their supply chain. So it all goes back to our fixation on cost. Is how do I get my cost down? Because we're really misconstruing. We say, if I can just reduce costs, then I'll increase profit, and increase profit, then return on investment improves. So here's the rules for the VUCA world. Plausel's law, all of us are familiar with this. I know George has been to South Africa several times. All benefits are directly related to the speed of flow of materials and information. George always said that. I never heard George do a presentation that he didn't bring that up. When a business focuses on flow, better cost performance follows. Always, because as things flow better, then you're not chasing yourself and you're not incurring all those extra expenses. However, the opposite is never the case. As you focus on cost, a company will always destroy flow. And a resource is productive if and only if it leads to better promotion and protection of system flow. And something's efficient if and only if it leads to better protection and promotion of system flow. Our old definitions of efficiency and utilization are really quite perverted, all right? These things, this efficiency and productive, are really only relevant if it improves overall system flow, all right? So what should we focus on? Well, something that's been around for a very, very long time. It's all about flow. And if you want to follow my Twitter feed, that is actually my Twitter handle. It's all about flow. This is nothing new. What we know is when I have good flow, I have good service. Right? We all know that. When I have good flow, my revenue is maximized. When I have good service, then I'm going to have customers that are going to want my products and services. When I have good flow, I also minimize my inventory. Anybody that's ever been around the a lean implementation at all knows that one of the byproducts of focusing on the lean tools is that inventory goes down. Inventories are minimized. Next, when our inventories are minimized and things are flowing well and nobody's, people are not running around with their hair on fire and all excited and stressed out, well, guess what? Expenses also go down. This is why total cost goes down when we focus on flow. Most importantly, cash flow follows the rate of product flow to market demand. So we don't have these big pools of unnecessary inventory that then we need to promote to try to move that inventory through the supply chain. So if I protect and promote flow, I'm going to maximize return on investment, pure and simple. So flow is nothing new. Okay. Who talked about flow? Well, they call these guys, there's the Trinity for MRP. George Plazel is right there on the right. All right. George, wonderful guy, used to travel with his wife Marion all the time. The guy on the left is the guy that wrote the book. He is the guy, it was called MRP, A New Way of Life in Production Inventory Management. Of course, that's Joe Orlicki. Right now we're working on the 4th edition of Joe's book. And the guy in the middle is the guy that thought up the idea of having something called MRP2. And Ollie White, the guy there in the middle, wrote that white paper in 1979. And by 1981, we had financials integrated into our computer systems. But as you look at the whole idea of formal planning, what really was the objective? Well, the objective was really, how do I synchronize demand and supply? In other words, how do I match up those two flows? As I look at our friend here, Taiichi Ono, it's always interesting as I ask this question around the world, I can always get everybody to tell me that the objective of lean is to reduce waste. And that's only what we've done to it in the Western world. We've distorted what Ono said. What Ono really wrote about is he wrote about what he called his river production system. Right? He talked about flow. We were so fixated on cost that we focused on one of the outputs of focusing on flow, which is that we reduce waste. It's one of the ways to improve flow is that we can reduce waste. Then, of course, my friend Dr. Goldratt had the honor and privilege of writing a book with him back right at the turn of the millennia, the year 2000. And his whole focus was, how do we improve system throughput? Okay. And what he recognizes, there was a constraint. Okay. There's a constraint. There's something that's limiting the company from being able to improve throughput. And of course, that 4th pillar, American bookends on both sides, is Dr. W. Edwards Deming. Okay, now Deming is the one that took quality to Japan. Now the Japanese actually honestly thought that Deming was teaching them how the Americans were already doing it. Of course he wasn't. And that was the precursor for Six Sigma. And what Deming understood is that if you can reduce variability, you're going to improve flow. So here's the 4 major ideas about how to manage a company. And for so many years, and I've been in the industry, I've been in what was now called supply chain for over 40 years. And we lived through what I call the war of or. It was either MRP or lean or TOC or Six Sigma. And we viewed these as being competitive, adversarial, crazy times. They're not. They all harmonize together because they have the same foundational pillar. It's all about flow and always has been. And that's really the key. All this time and effort that we spent about MRP good, lean bad, pull good, push bad, is just crazy. We can harmonize all these by focusing on that same foundational pillar of flow. Well, let's look at Plazel's law. He said all benefits directly related to the speed of flow of materials and information. So is this whole flow focus new? Well, of course not. Let's look at Taylor. Taylor's whole objective was what? He's the father of planning as a function of operations management, and his whole focus was rate. How do I get rate up? By taking out the variances, the variability, by breaking tasks into their smaller pieces. He was able to dramatically improve the output of a factory. Of course, he got a really bad name because a lot of people said he was anti-labor. But the reality was he was able to, by putting in rest and when you needed to move and consistent processes, and he brought to us the whole field of industrial engineering. Well, of course, a guy that learned from him is Henry Ford. Now, Ford would never admit it, but he did. And so what he did is he said, okay, we can vertically integrate, and still today we cannot produce an automobile in the speed that Ford did. He had vertical integration, mass production, And what his whole focus was is how can I produce a car that's so low in cost that every American could purchase one? And of course, that was the Model T. And they were producing them at tens of thousands of cars a day out of Detroit. Well, within a year after this guy, F. Donaldson Brown, hooked up with another very famous American businessman named Albert Sloan, and the two of them went to a very small startup company called General Motors. Now you might laugh because General Motors, as you think about it, is a very big company today. But what Brown understood, he's the father of managerial accounting, and what he understood and his objective was the market, is understanding what is the unmet need in the market, and then how is it that you align operations, and how do you include only relevant costs to bring forward a unique market value proposition. And of course, he and Sloan hooked up, and they went to General Motors. And within a year of that point, Ford's River Rouge plant was have to shut down because they had to retool the Model T because General Motors was stripping such share from Ford. Well, in every marketing book that you write, that you've ever read, they always point to the Ford to General Motors transition as the need for proliferation of models. Well, they're full of malarkey. What they're actually, the case was, is Brown and Sloan brought something to the market that had never been seen before, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the paint color on the car. What they brought to the market, remember, Brown is a managerial accounting guy. What he brought to the market was the idea of financing, GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation. For the first time, you could finance a car. You didn't have to pay for the car cash. You could buy it so much a month. So Americans flocked to that because they didn't have a lot of cash. All right, remember, we're just around World War I. All right, between World War I and World War II, not a lot of cash. The American economy is not doing all that great. But boy, people could, put together $1 or $2 a month and pay for a car on time. That's really what Brown brought to the market. And that's what's disrupted when you talk about the risks of supply chain. That was that disruptive model that happened outside of Ford's ecosystem that rendered his entire business model obsolete. So this isn't new. Just got a new name. It's called COVID. It looks like a little hairy ball. But the reality is that since the time of Taylor, it's all about flow. And in all these gentlemen, flow, not unit cost minimization, is the focus. That's what it's all about. So flow is the lever for return on investment. Okay. A lot of people think it's cost. That's why we stayed focused there. It's not. Flow is the lever. So how do I define flow? I can only improve those things that I can measure, right? Well, the definition for flow is the rate at which a system converts material to product that somebody's buying. All right. So flow is a systemic approach that converts material to product required by a customer. All right. Not to sit on the shelf, not to be efficient, not to look at our low unit cost because we made a bigger batch and now the thing is sitting in the warehouse. So as I get flow as defined by this definition, what happens is that as flow improves, what else improves? Well, of course, my cash velocity improves. Cash velocity is the rate of net cash generation. Now, what is that? That's my revenue minus my variable cost, okay, which is also known as contribution margin, minus my period operating expense. Okay, so that means what do I need to do? How much cash do I need to keep the place open this month? This is not overhead. Okay, this is not the allocation of cost for machines and people and all this. This is how much cash came out of my pocket for heat, light, rent, and salaries that month, because that is cash. I've got to pay my people every month or every week, depending on how I pay. Now, if I improve my cash velocity, then what happens? Well, then I've also improved my net profit divided by investment, right? Because net profit is revenue minus cost. All right, we're going to look at only relevant costs, which means that what happens? I improve ROI. So managerial accounting is I manage flow. Cost is the outcome and the management of flow. Okay, I can't stress this enough. Cost is the outcome and the management of flow. So when we look at flow and cost, when I attempt to unitize cost calculations, in other words, I try to spread overhead based on some driver, whether it's labor, whether it's some other activity-based costing methodology, what happens is that as I look at that historically, with better flow, I do get better unit cost. Because when things flow well, then our defined period costs are now controlled. As I focus on cost, I destroy flow and I destroy cash. So you end up with too much of the wrong stuff, not enough of the right stuff, and overall too much stuff. Cost was never intended to be a decision driver. All right, the whole idea of fully absorbed cost was designed after October 19th, 1929, and you can blame the Americans on this one. This was definitely our fault. When we invented generally accepted accounting practice. Okay, and that was, of course, Black Friday, and that's when the stock market crashed here in the United States. Why? Because companies were misrepresenting their assets and their values because there was no standardized accounting system. Okay, so it's typical to Americans. New laws come out, new cost accounting system comes out, and we get generally accepted accounting practice. So this is a way to spread overhead, to look at those cost drivers, but it was never intended to replace managerial accounting, which preceded cost accounting. So relevance lost. We've known about this stuff for years. To this point, if somebody says to me, Carol, I know about all this, good for you. You're right. We did. Nothing new. So what impedes flow? Well, of course, it's variability, and we're living in a highly variable time. So variability, the difference between what you think is going to happen and what's happening. Today, if you would have asked me on March 1st where I would have been today, not on a webinar sitting at home, I should have been in the air. I think I was scheduled to be somewhere in France right now. And instead, no, I'm home and have been for 3 months. It's the longest homestand that I've had since we started DDI. So that variability, how do I react to that? Well, as my variability goes down and as it becomes more predictable, my flow goes up, of course. As my variability goes up, of course, my flow goes down. Now, how do I mitigate that variability? Of course, it's with visibility. How do I define visibility? Relevant information for making decisions. As my visibility goes up, my variability goes down. That's a good thing. As my visibility goes down, my variability goes up. Now, I was born and raised actually in Western New York, not New York City, the other side. And so I was raised in a city called Buffalo, New York. Now, even in South Africa, I'm sure that you guys know about Buffalo, and they get snow and a lot of it. So what ends up happening is when we're in a blizzard, all right, you can't see. It's called a whiteout. All you can see is white on your windshield, and you go very, very slowly because you can't see the road in front of you. You sort of drive by braille. You drive by feel. We have something similar here in Arizona, and I think you guys might have them down there too. They're called haboobs, which is a big sandstorm where you can't see. Those you don't drive in because you literally cannot see, and people tend to run into each other and have a big case of bumper cars on the expressway. So as we have better visibility, then we can fly. My favorite South African story is I was landing in Joburg, and I looked out the window. We got to the gate. You could not see the aircraft next to us. The fog was so bad. And I had flown in from Paris that day, and the pilot comes on. He says, well, that was another fine landing, and I forget which name he used. Turns out it was a computer that had landed the aircraft. That South African Airways had that ability to land in that heavy, dense fog because of their technology, and the other airlines couldn't. And I thought, too much information. I did not want to know that a computer just landed that aircraft, but you couldn't see. It was like sitting in pea soup. So as we get better visibility, variability goes down. Well, visibility to what? Relevant information. So how do we distill relevant information out of this crazy VUCA world that's around us? Well, first, we need to understand what's a relevant range. Second, we need to define a flow-based operating model. Third, We need a bidirectional reconciliation between those ranges. And fourth, we need to measure our organization in such a way that we bring the organization into what's called coherence, where we bring our organization into alignment. Think in your organization of how much time and effort you spend of departments fighting each other. So what's a relevant range? Well, a relevant range is a time frame within which our assumptions are valid. Well, the assumptions are valid are going to be different depending on which time range we're looking at. As I force fit irrelevant assumptions into a wrong range, what do? I distort information. For example, okay, my favorite discussion. If you want to look at one of the nastiest discussions on LinkedIn is type in DDI and forecast, and you will see some horrible conversations, very unprofessional. And we have been accused of saying you don't need to forecast. DDI has never said you don't need to forecast. What we said is forecasting, operational planning is devastating. However, for tactical and strategic planning, how else are you going to try to figure out kind of where you're going in a forecast? Now, when you're using it for tactical and strategic planning, it doesn't have to be by the SKU level. Okay, it can be by the family level. Remember, higher level of aggregation means that you're going to be a little bit better. All right, okay, you can start to say we're going to go this direction and not that direction. So fixed costs are variable in the long range. They are not variable in the short range. A work order delay is relevant in the short range, not in the long range. You know, our executives don't care. You know, where we're trying to head to in 5 years, that there's a single work order delay today. Same for a machine breakdown. Now, here's the problem. This is where a lot of conflict comes in a company. Different relevant ranges are typically utilized by different people. The executives tend to look long-term, and they're looking at those mountains. The operations folks are looking near-term, and they're seeing hills. And the executives are out there talking about mountains, and the operations people think they're crazy. Well, they're not. They're both right. It's like blind people trying to describe an elephant, okay? They all have a different piece of the puzzle, and it's how we bring that together and bring it into what's called coherence. Now, a flow-based operating model. You know, there's two very different ways. There's lots of different ways to put together a flow-based model. No two are the same. All right, you see the one on the top, this is a consumer product. This is a make to stock. The one that's on the bottom is make to order. That's a number one question we get. Well, will demand driven work in make to order? Of course it will. But your configuration is not going to look like Procter & Gamble's. All right, how you're going to put your company together is going to be different. Now, flow-based models, this is nothing new. As we talked about, economics, mathematics, physics, managerial accounting, George, Ellie, Taichi, Dr. Deming, all these guys have been always talking about these flow-based models, but there's a very specific way on how to do it, okay? And there's something that when you bring these together and harmonize all these ideas, allows you to build this flow-based model. Now, tactical reconciliation, this has got to be probably, you know, people don't realize why I grin every time I look at the slide, because this slide only took us about a year, and I'm ashamed to admit I was that stupid, but it did. Now, why? Well, the reason why is because you're talking about flow. Flow leads you to the idea of pipes, and we kept trying to figure out how to graphically represent the connection of the operational relevant range, the strategic relevant range with pipes. What's the problem with that? Well, how many ways can flow move in a pipe? The answer is one. Flow always goes from high to low, right? So every graphic we saw of pipes was either a pressure gauge or a valve. It's like, no, that's not what we want. And I remember the day Dick Ling and I were working together, and I was like, all of a sudden it hit me, and I said, oh, Dick, we missed it. It's not a pipe, it's a bridge. It's a bi-directional bridge. So the assumptions and the information between the relevant ranges differ. All right, so on one side, you got the strategic relevant range. On the other side, you got the operational relevant range. And we have to constantly reconcile these assumptions. So it's bi-directional, it's iterative, it's constant. So strategy has to be impacted by operations, right? And operations has to be affected by strategy. Because our only source of sustainable competitive advantage is to exploit our unique operational capability that provides value to the customer and a profit to ourselves. That's it. Right? There is nothing else. There's other short-term things, all right, but there's nothing that in the long term that's going to give us a sustainable competitive advantage. It's how do I exploit my unique operational capability? But then that operational capability is also defined by the strategy of where I intend to go. So, how do we measure this? And if you really want to get me going on a soapbox, and I can stand on that soapbox for probably about an hour, is get me going on the balance scorecard. Just in the name tells you how devastating that concept is. Balance. What we're trying to do is find a spot between two opposing positions that if we can just balance there long enough, that somehow we'll be okay. Well, that's crazy too. What we need is metrics that bring the organization into coherence and alignment. So the metrics have to consider the fact that we need a flow-based operating model, that we've got relevant range, and that we need this tactical bidirectionality to bring these things together. So they got to fit the range, they have to fit the flow-based operating model, and they have to be reconcilable. Notice I did not say aggregated and disaggregated. When I attempt to force fit non-flow-based metrics into an organization, it does something that is incredibly devastating. It brings us conflicts, it brings us distortions, and it obscures what is relevant. So finally, you're going to hear the words demand-driven. Yes, there is a model that allows us to do this. Adaptive S&OP, we're actually working on that book. The first draft of the book is done. This is Dick Ling's new book on S&OP. Dick is the guy that invented sales and operations planning in the 80s. We are blessed that Dick is, yes, he's still alive. He is 83 years old and as sharp as a tack. And so Dick and I have just finished the first draft of the book. It's in Chad's hands now. And we're very, very excited about it because Dick said, and it was very interesting what Dick said when we sat back and saw what we wrote. He said, this is not a book on S&OP. This is a book on how to run a company. He says, on how to run a company successfully. And I thought, wow, then we have hit the target that we intended with that book. So we're very excited about that. But we need some kind of a strategic S&OP process that outputs the business plan. Well, that business plan then is translated, if you will, into a flow-based operating model, right? That gives us that model configuration. But it has to be bidirectional. Coming out of the flow-based operating model, we have to have a variance analysis. Okay, how is it that the model, the capability that we established, how's it performing? And then coming out of the tactical range, we need to evaluate scenarios. And that's why I love Clem. I mean, not to give Clem another plug, but what him and his co-author have done is they are the best at figuring out scenario planning. Well, as we look at those scenarios, how do I translate that into the required operational capability? And how do I understand my operational capability to see what is now possible strategically? Okay, how can I go after different markets? Well, we still need to be outside in. Right? I love it. We had somebody that emailed us this week actually tried to rip off some of our content. So we jumped on them for copyright infringement. He said, well, the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model is not outside in. I said, how do you figure? It's outside in on two sides. Okay, the one side is we're focusing on actual demand. Operational planning is activated only by actual demand. All right. So what's more outside in? And then on the second side, on the other side, the executives need to be focused on how is it that I can drive innovation in the marketplace? It's our only way to survive. How is it that I figure out what my customer's really looking for? Just like F. Donaldson Brown and Albert Sloan did and said, hey, what the Americans are not asking for, but what they need is a way to finance a car because they can't afford, they can't put together the cash. Americans have never really been good at saving, but we're really good at taking loans. And, how can we do that? How can we help them achieve that? So that market-driven innovation. That market-driven innovation is driving the company towards our intended desired future. We are no longer victims. We're not victims of what's happening around us. We are in the driver's seat when we can sense changes in the marketplace, adapt, planning and production, pull from suppliers, do it in real time, and innovate to the market. That's what this is all about. That's what the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model is all about. It's not demand planning. All right, it is not demand forecasting. It is a different way to run a business. It is a way that a business can become adaptive. And remember, you have two choices today. You either learn how to adapt or die. So this was the last book we wrote, the Demand-Driven Adaptive Enterprise. If you want more detail, and Ken, here you go. We put your quote in here today. I like what he said. We like what he said about it. It's not too long or too deep, but explains to management. This book was written for management. It's a short little book. Okay, it's less than 200 pages. To management and the executive of any company working in supply chain, why it's not their fault. It's why we're battling to succeed with the current planning and control systems that were developed 50 years ago. Because simply, those systems were developed 50 years ago for a world that we're not managing today. And so thanks, Ken, for the quote. We appreciate it with all of your certifications there. The one thing I do want to bring to your attention, there is self-study bundles that are available. And if you contact SAPIX, they can give you a discount voucher code that will take $200 off of that $650 price. And this is a price that has not been seen before and is, we've not announced this yet. So these bundles will go away at the end of June. So the bundles will go away at the end of June. This is the last month for these. So the bundles do include both the course and the exam. So this is usually the exam is already $250 by itself. So just want to bring your attention, but please contact SAPIX for their voucher code so that way you don't have to pay the $650. All right, that's what I have for you today. They asked me to leave about 10 minutes for questions, so it looks like we hit that pretty well. So Tonya, what questions do we have out there?
Okay, fire away, audience. Who has questions? I know that was a lot of information to digest, but I'm pretty sure that you have some questions for Carol that are pressing that you want to take to. Everybody's very quiet now.
Yeah, they're quiet now.
I'm not seeing any questions coming through on the chat, and nobody seems to be putting up their hand with anything.
I think, Tony, just from my side, a huge thank you to Carol, because it finally makes sense. I appreciate that. I've always been a bit confused by it all.
I'm glad that helped, Chantal. It is for me definitely complex.
Yeah, it's complex and it's simple. I mean, the reality is that supply chains are complex adaptive systems. Always have been. They've never been linear. They've never been chains. And the problem is that we've taken all the tools and the rules that were designed for chains and linear systems and tried to apply it to a system that was not linear. Supply chains are non-linear systems. The reason it makes sense is because these are tools that are designed for complex adaptive systems. They're designed for organizations that don't stay in any steady state too long, that small things can make a big difference, that you can't mathematically optimize the supply chain because it doesn't stay in any steady state too long. So yeah, thanks. It's everybody keeps talking about DDMRP, and we appreciate that. But DDMRP, if you notice, I didn't even talk about it in the last hour. All that is it's a safe first step for an organization. And you say, well, how do you do a major business transformation by focusing on a planning process first? And it's because what it does is it moves the organization from a linear focus to an appropriate focus because it is a complex adaptive system. So it's very safe, it's very understandable, it's very intuitive. You get great results very quickly, and that gives people the momentum to keep going. But it's just the start. And I always have to be honest with people. It's like, you start down that road, you're in for major transformation. This is not see spot run. This is not simple but it is a leverage point. It dramatically impacts companies. As COVID started to hit, we started to see the impacts. It was interesting to hear from around the world the impacts to the companies that had implemented demand driven. And I had just left Colombia, and I asked the Colombians, and I said, how they do it? How are you guys doing down there in the grocery stores? They said, oh, no problem. What? I said, America, we're empty. Yeah, he said, no, no problem. Most of the retailers, because remember, the application of demand driven to retail started in Colombia. So most of them have already gone down that road. So they were able to absorb that kind of hit and just keep going. Of course, their supply chains are a lot shorter down there too than ours are up here.
So I have there's a comment in the chat here. If I understand correctly, does it mean that people have been focusing on the wrong thing for years? Could we conclude?
Hallelujah. Yes, absolutely.
Can we conclude that the concept of flow is a timeless concept?
Correct. Absolutely. We have been fixated on cost. And we've been fixated on cost since the invention of generally accepted accounting practice. The problem is GAAP came out of 1929. Now, there's another reason why October 19th, 1929 is important, and that's because it was the day my mom was born. Mom's here with me now. We moved her out to the ranch last night. But, you know, there's very few people around that are my mother's age. And when I talk to professionals, you know, as you all logged on and I saw faces and all that, you're all young people. I would say 99% of the people on this phone don't remember a time when there was not a computer system. Doesn't remember a time when there wasn't cell phones. Don't remember a time when there wasn't GAAP. So our whole fixation, because that's how we were taught. You know, our schools taught us that we wanted to reduce costs, that it was all about GAAP, that we were taught this financial accounting process. And you might say, oh, okay, Carol, what makes you so smart that, you know, the whole world's focused on cost and you guys flip to flow? Well, you know what? It's not the first time something has discovered what's called the deep truth. Think about in 1492, when Columbus sailed from Spain, the whole European community thought he was heading to India. Well, he didn't hit India. He hit us. All right. And that's why it's called the New World. And that's why our indigenous people from North America were called Indians. Now, the interesting thing is he never got to the United States. He hit Central America, which explains why they all speak Spanish. But you think about that at that point, they thought India lied due west of Europe. You know, another one is you think back even further, you know, to the Copernicus and Galileo. At the time, the world thought the earth was the center of the universe, right? And that man was most powerful on earth. So therefore, man is the center of the universe. Well, wrong. What happened is we could see further. Think about it. Copernicus and Galileo, they developed telescopes and they could see further. They had relevant information. And they're like, guys, the earth and the planets and the stars aren't moving in the right orbit. Earth is not the center of the universe. Remember how much joy that was greeted with. Okay, those two. Let's see, Copernicus, I think, was excommunicated from the church. Galileo, they tried to hang him. You know, not a good time. All right. So the same way, whoever wrote that, absolutely very intuitive. We have been fixated on cost, and it's wrong. And it's global. Okay. The fixation on cost is as global as COVID is. It's all about flow. And companies that focus on flow are able to withstand the kind of hits that we're seeing. Remember, it's not a matter of if, it's when. If you look back in 2008, when the economy melted down here in the United States, one of the early adopters of demand-driven, it's called Tube Forgings of America, or the case studies on our website. They watched in 6 months as 50% of the revenue, 50% of the revenue disappeared. Now what are you going to do? Well, you know, first you panic, right? Well, they didn't. They said, okay, 50% of our revenue just disappeared. They make tube forgings, which look like big macaroni, but they're for nuclear gas, so big macaroni. And what they did is they shifted from make to stock to make to order. Because as we know, Little's Law, what? My work in process, my lead time, and my throughput. So if I hold my throughput, my work in process goes down by half, then my lead time goes down by half. So they flipped, they switched to a different market proposition, and they took to the market the ability to say, we can make whatever you need. Their competitors stayed in the current model. they continued to make things to stock. And guess what? Well, when you're in the nuclear, oil, and gas business, and the economy's just melted down, all of a sudden now all the nuclear, oil, and gas are in maintenance mode and not in construction mode. Well, the parts you need for maintenance are absolutely the opposite of what you need for construction. So all their competitors stocked exactly the wrong stuff. Tube forgings not only survived, they did not lay off a single person. They maintained profitability, and they got through the crisis just fine. Thank you very much. Now, this is why when people said, well, have you had any results of demand-driven companies coming through this crisis? This crisis? No, we haven't gotten this far through this crisis. But previous crises? Yeah. You look at 2008, lots of companies now, have gone through that. Obviously, we didn't have the implementation base that we do today. So, yeah, we're going to be sending out surveys and working with the companies that have implemented demand-driven to see how they have been able to adapt. But that's just one quick story from the last crisis in 2008. So, yeah, absolutely, Tanya. Perfect articulation. We have been fixated on the wrong thing. It's all about flow.
Okay, so here's a tricky one, and I know from experience with dealing with some of our members that have implemented the methodology. How do I influence a financial director that thinks it's all about cost? How do you get them to see past the cost element? It's difficult when you're challenging the people at the top that are making the decisions and are not necessarily prepared to make change.
Well, I would get to the CFO, all right, because what happens is there's a middle level management that is taking the overall objective from the CFO, which is ROI, and how they're translating it is because ROI is net profit divided by investment. You're saying, well, net profit is revenue minus cost, so operationally the only thing we can impact is cost, therefore we're cost focused. I have never met a CFO that I have had the conversation with to say, what's your goal? And they usually come back with make money. Great. How do you measure that? And then they say, well, profit. Okay. How do you measure that? Revenue minus cost. Okay. So that's why your operations people are fixated on cost. Yes. Great. I said, is it really? I said, if I told you that I made 250,000 US dollars last year, did I do well? Well, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? I thought you just told me the cost, that profit was your number one focus. Well, no, because it depends. What does it depend on? You can tell I've had this conversation several times. What does it depend on? Well, how much do you have invested? I said, oh, so if I invested $1,000 and I made $250,000, did I do well? Oh, yeah, clearly you did very well. Okay, so then is profitability your overall objective? Or is it ROI? Because if I've invested $10 million and made $250,000 in profit, I did poorly. So it's getting that shift from this idea of profit, make money now and into the future, to it's ROI. It's return on investment. Profitability is secondary. It's two factors in that equation. It's net profit and investment. So getting the conversation uplifted to talking about ROI, and invariably, I have been all over the world. I can't tell you how these CFOs from small companies to very, very large companies. I did a thing for an affiliate where we had where we did an event, and the CFO of a $22 billion company was in the room. I did my whole shtick. First question came from the CFO. You could visually hear, you could actually feel the whole room go, waiting for the question. And it was exactly that question. Well, aren't costs important? I said, of course costs are important. I said, but they're not your primary importance. Your primary importance is ROI. And we went through this whole conversation. He said, well, you're absolutely right. But and his next quote was great. I've never seen a supply chain professional talk about ROI. And as supply chain professionals, that's what we got to be doing. We need to be talking their language. As Tanya said in my introduction, I'm the only female that's ever served as Apex president. And I remember during my presidency, we talked a lot about how we could get executives to speak our language of supply chain. Boy, were we wrong. We need to talk the executive's language. And the exec's language is the language of ROI. And that's what we need to be going at them with. And that's how you move somebody from cost to flow, because flow is what drives return on investment.
Thank you, Carol. There are some other comments coming through. What I want to say is that we have a number of DDI events coming up in the next couple of weeks. Please look at our event calendar covering the full suite of products and activities that they have on offer. So please watch out for that. There's a lot to learn, a lot of takeaways that you can get from attending those sessions. We have recorded the session, and Carol, you are okay with us flighting that on our website?
Absolutely.
Okay. We have a number of, like I mentioned in the beginning, DDI global affiliates in our stable here who are more than willing and able to come and talk to you and help you to get a project off the ground. I think in conclusion to say it doesn't have to be a massive project. I think that if you were to start small and start with a few items and show the return and how it's working and what the financial benefits are, and the benefits to the organization, that's the best way to start. Instead of going in there with all guns blazing and trying to convince somebody that doesn't want to be convinced, that's maybe the way to go. So we've seen that happen here in South Africa. We've had a lot of uptake from starting small, growing big, and we've had some really, really successful adoptions here in South Africa with incredible results. So it's definitely proven, it works. And if you want more information, you can give us a shout at SAPEX and watch out on our event calendar for the upcoming events. Carol, thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us this afternoon. We really, really appreciate it. I think it's been an eye-opener and a lot of really good information for the people in the session today. And I trust that they've all enjoyed it.
Great. Well, and what's so nice now is that you do have so many resources, local resources there in South Africa. You've got great trainers, because I can't stress it enough. Start with education. It's critically important that your people understand why and what before you get into the house. Because as Tanya said, start with a small project, learn from that, get on to the next phase. You don't have to, it's not a blow the whole company up in one shot. Get those benefits as you go along. You can save your company and really recover more quickly through this COVID crisis by doing this. It's not too late.
Okay, so we should expect lots of inquiries coming in from all you people that need to be getting yourselves through COVID-19 out the other side hugely successfully. Carol, thank you again. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your support. And we look forward to another webinar in the not too far future, hopefully.
Very good. Thanks, Tanya.
That's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And like I said, the recording will be made available so you can watch it again in your own time and absorb all that good content. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here.